Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I'm doing another one. This time we're talking about Asia in the 19th century. We're going to start to talk about how Asia, specifically sort of East Asia, South Asia, through the Ottoman Empire, how they're going to be reacting to the advances in Europe, how they're going to be reacting to industrialization, all these sorts of things. So during the long 19th century, this is sort of the same time period we were looking at the Americas last time. These states in Asia really work to sort of conserve their past, their unique sort of cultures and histories, but also reform their societies to ensure they were competitive in the face of European aggression or in the face of colonization, or sort of not wanting to fall behind in the modern era and what that looked like. So today we'll talk about the Ottoman Empire, then we'll talk about the Russian Empire, then we'll talk about the Qing Dynasty in China. So the Ottoman Empire, as we saw before, was originally, when we think about it, one of those gunpowder empires or Islamic empires, although we talked about, both of those terms are a little funky. Anyway, they're going to slowly be declining during this period, largely because of the way the empire is sort of shrinking and the effect that that has on the state overall. So to get you started, you can think about the sort of territorial losses of the Ottoman Empire, and the book does a pretty good job showing this as a graphic straight from there. During this long period of about 100 years, 115 years, the Ottoman Empire is just slowly going to shrink away from North Africa, from what today is the Middle East, from Eastern Europe, right? These sorts of areas, and become more and more concentrated around today what's Turkey, right, or Istanbul, like this area, as the sort of seat of power. So all kinds of problems begin to happen, though, when you lose territory. Remember, with empires, territory is key, right? They're not nation states, although it was sort of moving that direction. In an empire, right, you're supposed to be multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-language, right? But the goal is for the elites at the sort of center of empire to capitalize on all the resources that are out there. As the empire starts to recede, you get a lot of sort of local leaders and local folks who are trying to modernize on their own, trying to carve out their own particular version of what the future will look like, either in places that are formerly part of the empire or just in their corner of the empire that they hope to improve upon. So one example we might look at is in Egypt, Muhammad Ali. He is going to try and institute a period of modernization in Egypt after Napoleon attacks. So remember when we were looking at the Atlantic revolutions, we looked a little bit at Napoleon and his armies just kind of messing up Europe until he got caught, these sorts of things. One of the places he went sort of immediately before that, right, was Egypt. That's where he gets a lot of his early military training before he goes back to be, the emperor and stuff like that. So when Napoleon attacks, it throws a lot of Egypt into chaos. There's conflicts between Britain and France and Egypt and the Ottoman Empire. It's pretty complicated. Out of that sort of chaos, Muhammad Ali is going to say, look, if we want to resist these foreigners, if we want to be as good as them, if we want to be on par with them and be able to defend ourselves, we need to do what they're doing. Industrialization had started in Britain. It was spreading across sections of France, of the United States, and leaders all over the world were looking at it saying, that stuff seems to really be working. Those places are having, these economic booms and military booms. We should do the same thing. So his sort of pillars of modernization that he wanted to approach revolved around industrializing the country. Could Egypt start to make their own machines, make their own factories? If so, what other reforms might this lead to? Well, you might want a military reform. You might want to change the way soldiers are conscripted or the way the army works or the sorts of weapons that they have. This might also lead to governmental changes. If you're introducing broader ideas from capitalism and sort of that industrial capitalism that we looked at, in some ways it might require you to open up your government or change how you encourage the citizens to participate, right? That sort of ideas of popular sovereignty and stuff like this. Rather than being under an empire, if you want the citizens to start to suddenly work for the nation, to modernize it, to project it sort of into the future, you have to really get them on board. So Muhammad Ali was just one of the people trying this, in particular in Egypt, but this is happening sort of all over the Ottoman Empire. That's going to lead to some problems for the seat of power there back in Istanbul. But it also shows that there were local developments, people trying to capitalize on these sorts of things in their own communities, in their own cities, in their own almost sort of nation states. They're not quite there yet, but they're moving in that direction. At the same time that you have local folks kind of getting a national sense or a national consciousness, there's other broader problems within the Ottoman Empire. For example, we might look at the Janissaries. Remember, these were Christian boys that were taxed, essentially. They were taken from their families. They were trained in the military arts, the political arts, and at one point they were just the premier soldiers in the world. They were using new technology in ways that most people weren't. They were embracing firearms and cannons, and were widely regarded as just these amazing sort of soldiers, vanguard forces. But they frequently had rebellion issues in the 17th and 18th century as there were changes in the empire overall. So they had a sort of political dynamic to them as well. They weren't just soldiers, right? So often when you think about the armed forces, people within them are supposed to be politically neutral. They're supposed to serve the state. But that's not always the case, and the Janissaries kind of walk that line in a pretty fine way. This comes to more of a head in the 19th century when things are changing quickly in the empire. There's military losses, there's territorial losses. The folks who are in the Janissary are elites in some ways, but they're not necessarily given all the respect they should be politically anymore. So by this point, they've stopped really paying attention to all of those advanced military tactics and techniques. They've sort of fallen behind. One of the problems almost with being like too strong, sometimes you get complacent. They didn't necessarily adopt new technology because they were already, cutting edge at one point. And they had this belief in their own sort of superiority. But the problem is British forces, European forces, even other Asian nations that we're going to see like Japan, were developing and changing and far sort of outpacing the former military elite in the region. But it's not just military problems. This is coupled with sort of economic problems the Ottoman Empire was having. Overall, people might argue they were slow to industrialize compared to the British, who sort of developed these new techniques and the sort of factories. When you look at the United States or Germany or France or Japan, they saw these sorts of things and they wanted on board really quickly. In the Ottoman Empire, there's a little bit more pushback. And in that moment, rather than creating machines and value-added products and sort of the final stage of products, they're still providing the majority of raw materials. And this gives them some economic benefit. They can provide a lot of raw materials to the European industrial powers. But as we're going to see more and more kind of for the rest of the class, nation states that tend to provide raw materials tend to be relegated to a lower economic status than people who create the manufactured products or who create the industrialized capitalist societies that are able to pump out those finished products. You'd rather probably your community was heavily invested in computer production than soybean production, if you're talking about tax base and stuff like this. At the same time, the primary driver for economic loss is just the loss of territory. So I showed you that map, the Ottoman Empire is shrinking, shrinking, shrinking. Well, the way empires work is they have to grow, they have to take over new places, they have to tap new resources. If they keep shrinking, they just get less revenue. There's fewer people to tax, there's fewer resources to exploit, less mines, less farms, less access to ports, trade routes, all that sort of stuff. So when these sorts of things pile up on top of each other, you can have some real problems. Also, with the Janissary kind of retreating from its position as top economic power in the region, the empire starts to have military losses all around the fringe in Eastern Europe, when they're up against Russia, when they're in North Africa. And if your empire has military losses, that also translates into economic losses. If you lose soldiers or equipment or positions, you give up a lot of those resources. So by the 1900s, the Ottoman Empire was in big trouble, right? This is when people start talking about the sick old man of Europe and that sort of thing. How true that is a little bit questionable, but by 1900, the government was struggling to pay off its debts each year. And it wasn't quite to the sort of modern economic system where governments have as much debt as you like, right? The US has an incredible amount of debt. At this point, that wasn't really okay, and that might lead to a lot more failures in government. So the Ottoman elites and leadership did what any elite in this sort of position might try to do. They tried to reform. They looked around and they said, things are falling apart here pretty quickly. We're losing our status relative to our neighbors. Our economy is in decline, our military is in decline. What shall we do? So you can see both sort of individuals and systems that try to make changes. For example, you might look at Muhammad II. He's going to rule in the sort of early period that we're talking about here, like the 1800s, right? And he realized that if he didn't engage in some sort of reforms, if he didn't change the nation, or maybe even create a nation in a certain way, the empire would simply end. So his ideas were, let's modernize the military, let's modernize social orders, let's get rid of this Janissary troops who are all high on themselves. Instead, let's have a conscript military, let's train officers, all these sorts of things. And while he was able to push the idea of a lot of these things, they didn't necessarily start when he's the ruler. It's actually after he's out of office that you start to get a lot of these reforms. And this era is called the Tazimat era. There's a lot of sort of transitions in the empire as the empire is moving almost towards being a sort of modern nation state rather than an empire at all. You start to get legal changes, economic changes, sort of military industrial complex. Everything that could be modernized was. So you see this political cartoon, right, talking about reforms, ever ready to oblige, right? These sort of reform, the guns that the people are pointing right at the Ottoman leader are called reforms. So everything has to change. And in some ways, this comes with a sense of sort of what people might call anti-Westernism. A lot of these groups we're going to look at today, whether that be the Ottomans, Russia, China, have this sense that the Western powers are infringing upon them. They're attacking them. They're sort of shooting ahead of them so fast that by comparison they look weak. And this often gets depicted as anti-Westernism, like, these people were opposed to Europeans or something like this. But that's not quite it. These people wanted the things Europe had. They liked industrialization. They liked higher living standards. They liked machines that were labor saving, all these sorts of things. But they didn't necessarily want to be Western. So they didn't want to become Christian necessarily. They didn't want to learn a European language. They didn't want to abandon their cultural traditions. So how do you do this? How do you reform your country, adopt all of these things that are coming out of Europe or the United States, but not lose your nation's individual character? Because remember, when we talked about nation states have to be unique, they have to be, in order for the story to work, and in order for the idea of a nation state to work, your country has to be its own thing, culturally, religiously, whatever. So this is problematic, and the sort of reforms in the Ottoman Empire maybe pushed too fast, too far, and you get a sort of pushback against that, right? So a couple leaders down the line, you have Abdulhamid II, who is going to start to roll back these reforms. The reforms are changing society too rapidly, right? And so you get a more conservative leader in power who says, society's changing too much. We're losing our identity. We're not Ottomans anymore. Something's happening. We need to dial it back. But that's not popular with everybody. Ideas had been sneaking into the Ottoman Empire about liberty, democracy, freedom, new economic ideas, new ideas about science, all kinds of stuff. And you can't really roll that back so easily. So in response to this pushback, you get another wave of reformers. The Young Turks, which is a sort of organization. It's kind of funny because they're not that young actually. From the name, you might be like, oh, these are like young revolutionaries. It's not necessarily true. They're sort of more talking about the Turkish society that they envision that's new. So this is founded during the sort of pushback to these reforms. These are elite Ottoman subjects who had been exposed to Europe, had been exposed to the rest of Asia, and they had a real sense of why they wanted to modernize, why they wanted to industrialize, and what that meant. They demanded a sort of revolution, a change, maybe even an end to empire, maybe something else. Maybe they should have a sort of nation state, a liberal democracy, who knows? But their goals were pretty straightforward. You have a revolution, you completely modernize along European lines. They wanted universal suffrage, so people are in a democratic world. They wanted freedom of religion. The Ottoman Empire had long been run by Muslim elites, but actually was populated by tons of different religious groups and sects. And this led to an overwhelming transformation in society, putting these people in power. But like most revolutions, once you have these sorts of massive changes and new people come into power, it's always a question of how much is really going to change and what those people in power are really going to do. So we'll have to kind of hold off a little bit on that. So let's turn for a second away from the Ottoman Empire and to Russia, although their histories are a little bit intertwined during this period. So in Russia at this time, in the 19th century, they still have a Tsar. Tsar is just the Russian word for Caesar, right? Sort of meaning emperor or king, something equivalent. And during this period, Russia had grown to be an incredible power, stretching from Eastern Europe all the way over to the Pacific. I think today it's like 8 time zones, right, of territory. So just an incredible state, a huge amount of resources. But the forces holding the Russian Empire together were getting stretched a little tenuously, and we should see what's going to happen as they sort of try to modernize and try to face the same circumstances as the Ottoman Empire. One of the early sort of turning points during this period, this 19th century, for Russia was the Crimean War. So essentially, remember the Ottoman Empire was kind of falling apart and losing territory and lacking military strength in some ways. So Russia is going to try and take advantage of that to carve off a little bit of territory from the Ottoman Empire. They'd already done this successfully in the past, and they're going to do so in the future again. But this point was a little bit more tricky. They were hoping to expand a little bit into Crimea, which is this area sort of south and actually kind of back east a little bit from the main sort of Moscow area where you might think of Russia, kind of connecting them to the Caucasus. But even though Russia wins this war and they're able to beat up on the Ottoman Empire, other European powers don't really like it. So remember, Napoleon had attacked Russia, Napoleon had messed up Europe, but a lot of the other European powers were now modernizing their militaries and industrializing their armies, new guns, new tactics. Russia had been doing this to an extent, but a little bit slower. So other European forces are going to see what Russia's doing, and they're going to be worried that maybe Russia will be outpacing them. So essentially, European forces band together briefly to attack Russia, to sort of put pressure on them to say what they're doing is wrong. They're changing the balance of power in Europe too much, and they're going to say it's in order to protect neutrality, to defend each other, to make sure Europe is okay. But really, these other European states are just worried about their own strength. When they do this, they handily beat up Russia. So Russia really quickly goes from winning this fight against a great empire to being, trounced by other European powers. And when this happens, they realize the reason that they lost, or the reason that they won against the Ottomans, all has to do with the sort of level of modernization and industrialization, whatever that might mean. And that in order to continue to win in the future, or to make Russia great again or something, they would need to embrace these novel developments that were happening around the world. So one of the first things that Russia is going to try to do is try to make their nation state develop. They're an empire, they're ruled by a czar, but these ideas of liberty and democracy and freedom and stuff are all floating around. The government hopes to embrace some of them, and at the very least give the illusion that they're embracing these things, but also prevent their citizens from rebelling, or prevent other European states from seeing them as barbarous, or keep up with the times, sort of, as it were. And so Tsar Alexander II is going to take the first sort of big steps and say, okay, let's modernize the country. What does that mean? Well, we want to get rid of old traditions that are holding us back. And one of the old traditions that is holding us back is the tradition of serfs being tied to the land. So in 1861, the Tsar declares, that's it, the emancipation of the serfs. No more serfs. And remember, we looked at what it was like being a serf a little bit before. It's often compared to slavery, although in many ways it's different. But essentially, serfs were people who were born in a village, and you weren't owned, but the people who owned the land could prevent you from leaving, and you were forced to work on it. A little bit different. But in this case, okay, all the serfs are free, meaning you have entire villages of people that had been laborers, entire farming communities, families for generations that had been tied to one spot, and now the government says, congratulations, you're free. You can travel, you can choose a different job, you can relocate. The goal was to sort of create a modern workforce. Remember, with factories, right, you bring everything to the factory. So if you're making a factory outside of Moscow, you need workers to come to that factory. Great, so the serfs can relocate to where there's better jobs, they can participate. In theory, for capitalism to work, right, labor needs to be free to move around as well. Although that's not really the case, as we know from slavery in the American South, or whatever. Anyway, the goal was to make the country more modern. It's tricky though. If your family for generations has been tied to one particular occupation, one particular plot of land, one particular taxation scheme, you might not have a lot of skills, you might not have a lot of ambition to leave, you might not have the resources to, pursue your dreams, you might not really have dreams in that sense of going and doing something else. It's really hard. At the same time that the population is suddenly free to engage in new occupations or travel, or to change their situations, the state itself begins to force industrialization on the empire more broadly. And this is spearheaded by Count Sergei Witt, who is going to say, look, the British system of industrialization, or what's happening in the United States or even in Germany, was a long process. People slowly figured these things out and started to combine these ideas over the last 100 years. What we should do is, as a nation, just do it all at once. We can't rely on people to just slowly develop new machines and slowly make the sorts of legal practices required for capitalism to function well and slowly build new forms of housing and government. It's way too long. What we should do is industrialize the nation fully from the start. Just imagine a new nation state, imagine a new sort of labor system, and then put all of the sort of machinery of that in operation and just go. Let's not wait for people to adjust. Let's not wait for the economy to respond. Let's just spend the government's money to just shotgun this stuff sort of into the future. You can't rely on the people to do it. So the Tsarist government engages in this massive project of industrializing the state, developing railroads, changing the economy, making factories, relocating people. And there's this huge push to change what it means to be Russian, what it means to be a citizen, how the economy works, everything. This doesn't go over really well. It works in the sense that Russia gets railroads and factories and new military technology and all of these sorts of things practically overnight, at a huge expense to the government and to people. But it's too much. It's too much change. It's too much transition almost too fast. And the government can't quite control everything they've unleashed. They're letting all of this stuff out of the box, but people aren't totally ready for it. People aren't on board yet. They haven't adapted to it. Also, in order for this to work, you have to tax people pretty heavily. You have to demand people work a lot, which was a whole different thing than being on the farm. So there's a lot of discontent with this push to just radically change society. This leads to these sorts of early revolutions and early push against the Russian state. This is not the communist revolution in Russia that's coming later. Basically, from the middle of the 19th century on, these new reforms were rolled out. They were harsh on the people, they were harsh on the economy. They demanded change really quickly that people weren't necessarily comfortable with. So you get a new sort of groups of people debating political ideas, looking at what's happening in Europe, trying to figure out what they want. You get anarchists, you get revolutionaries who demand change. The box has been opened. They're getting industrial weapons, they're getting industrial machinery, they're getting new economic standards, but they also feel left behind, they feel abandoned by the state, they feel like if they're going to get pushed so hard, they want rights within the new system. At the same time, across Europe, there's new writings about communism, there's new writings about the nation state, there's people and philosophers working on the sort of fallout from the Atlantic revolutions and what that means, what freedom is, all these sorts of things start to be discussed amongst the elites. They get discussed amongst intellectuals, students, all kinds of people like this who demand change. In the Russian case, this comes with a lot of anti-Jewish violence, which had been a common theme in Russian history, these sort of pogroms against Jews. There were all kinds of conspiracy theories about Jewish economic practices or cultish behavior, just like there are today, right? Anti-Semitism is still very much around. But in this instance, it was sort of tied to this modernizing process. Everything that was sort of too modern was also somehow sort of depicted as kind of Jewish and thus problematic. All of these revolutions come to a head in 1881 when Alexander II is murdered. So the Tsar gets murdered. This is a crazy situation, um, and leads to an incredible backlash against not only all of the protesters and people calling for more freedoms, but also against the system of sort of modernization itself. Nobody's going to roll up the railroad lines. Everybody wants to keep the guns, of course, but the idea that like the nation should change and it should be more European or more open to these other ideas, now the government is hostile towards that. Maybe they made a mistake. They appear to have given the people enough freedom to sort of rebel against them, and that's not what they were hoping for at all. A few years later, as we're going to see in the next lecture, Russia and Japan are going to go to war, and Japan is going to win. All of this stuff is piling up, and in 1905, it finally leads to a full-on revolution in Russia, where the Tsarist government is overthrown. Again, this is not the communist revolution. If you sort of know about this stuff, that's coming a decade and a half later here. But there is a sort of revolution put in place, and the Russian government, the monarchy, is essentially destroyed. There's a good couple Disney movies about this if you've seen those. Anywho, this is going to reshape this giant state that kind of has one foot in Asia, one foot in Europe, and lead to a complex set of problems that we'll kind of get into more with World War I coming down the line. So what about over in China? This is the other sort of giant Asian power, sort of continental Asian power. The Qing Empire is going to have a slightly different sort of trajectory than Russia or the Ottoman Empire. They start to get pressure more directly from European forces and try to react to it in a sort of different way, but might have a similar outcome. In the sort of middle of the 19th century, this is going to come to a head in China. The British East India Trading Company had a fundamental problem. They wanted all the cool stuff from China, but they didn't have a great way to pay for it. As we've talked about earlier, right, with the Ming and Qing dynasties, were like really interested in silver from Europeans, but they didn't really want European stuff. They thought everything they were doing was already cooler anyway. So the British did eventually hit on a product from their empire that was good in China, opium. So they found out they could grow opium really easily in certain parts of India. That could then be taken to China and could be sold to the Chinese somewhat indefinitely in exchange for Chinese products. Now, of course, the government didn't like this. They didn't want people bringing in massive amounts of drugs into their country. So they tried to set up opposition to this. They make it illegal. It had formerly been okay. Opium was the sort of sticky sap that comes out of poppies if you score them in a certain way. And people sometimes smoked it for getting rid of like toothache pain, or it was sometimes like snuffed, other things like this. But just like most other drugs, it hadn't been refined. It wasn't industrialized in the same sense that it is today, right, with heroin or Oxycontin and other stuff. So it was relatively mild by comparison, but it had a horrendous effect on the Chinese. They weren't used to this drug in their society. There was lots and lots of it. If you start to smoke opium, you have like totally conscious changing sort of stuff. You get like really sleepy, you totally hallucinate. It has all kinds of side effects when you use it long term. So the Chinese want to get rid of it. They sent a special sort of task force down to southern China where the British were bringing in all this stuff. Commissioner Lin, he's pictured here, right, looking out over the deck on all these people who are destroying the opium. And he passes laws that say the British can't bring it in anymore. Well, from the British perspective, they were engaging in free trade, right? And the world was supposed to be run by the ideas of Adam Smith and capitalism, and if people will buy it, then other people should be able to sell it, etc., etc. So from the British perspective, they said, why are these Chinese all of a sudden preventing us from engaging freely in, the God-given right to buy and sell things? Also, Commissioner Lin confiscated a bunch of opium that had been illegally brought into China and had it destroyed. When he did this, the British freak out because they're losing money, and they decide to go to war to teach those, Chinese a lesson. The British had industrialized their navy, they had industrialized their cannons, and they make pretty quick work of the Chinese. And when they do this, they force the Chinese to sign a treaty in 1842 with tons of negative sort of verbiage in it. But the Chinese don't have much of a choice. They had been really beaten up on by the British. This comes to be termed an unequal treaty. And basically what it means is the British get everything, the Chinese get nothing. It's a crazy sort of settlement. And I'll go through some of the sort of particulars of the treaty, but first, let me show you this video about Commissioner Lin and some of these sort of more particulars for the Opium War to show you just a sort of nice video representation of this stuff. Oh yeah, there's a nice picture of the Opium War as well.
In this film, produced in 1959, the Communist government of China told its version of the Opium War.
倾销鸦片，毒害了千千万万的中国人民。到1838年，仅广州一地就输入了4万多箱鸦片，抢走了3000多万两银子，中国的经济濒于破产了。这是中国人民不能容忍的。
The hero of this film is an incorruptible official named Lin Zexu.
林则徐，我派你为钦差大臣。
The Manchu emperor appointed Lin High Commissioner, a virtual drug czar, with the power of the empire to stop the Canton opium trade.
臣领旨谢恩。
In 1839, Commissioner Lin arrived in Canton to survey the forces he would use to stop the opium trade.
这炮是哪一年出的？
乾隆42年，比我还大3岁了。
能够试一炮吗？
行，请吧，开炮。大帅，您看，咱们就是这样的炮。
The Manchu military power was basically built, like the Mongols, was built on horse. They simply did not expect that the new groups of barbarians would not come from the continental border, but from the sea.
Lin wanted to know more about the foreign devils who were pushing opium.
小王，那不是商馆吗？是的。把船靠近一点。
As he surveyed the Canton factories, Lin decided that the British merchants must be outlaws. The British government couldn't possibly support men like these.
So here you have a macho British trader who feels limited by a condescending Chinese system. For the Chinese Mandarin, they will say, well, who are these people? Just a bunch of real barbarians who drink and who eat and who do all these nasty things, and who, of course, smuggle opium.
Lin decided to write a letter to a more cultured foreigner, the Queen of England.
There is a class of evil foreigner that makes opium and brings it for sale, tempting fools to destroy themselves merely in order to reap profits. What is here forbidden to consume, your dependencies must be forbidden to manufacture. If you do, you will be acting in accordance with decent feeling, which may also influence the course of nature in your favor.
The British never delivered Lin's letter to the Queen. Impatient for results, Commissioner Lin blockaded all foreigners in their Canton factories. Then he forced the Canton traders to hand over their entire opium stock, over 3 million pounds. Not wanting to burn it lest people inhale the fumes, he ordered it dissolved in river trenches. These are the trenches where Lin dissolved the opium. Standing on these banks, Lin offered a prayer as the opium flowed to the sea.
You who wash away all stains and cleanse all impurities should tell the creatures of the water to move away for a time, to avoid being contaminated. The foreigners do not dare to show any disrespect. And indeed, I should judge from their attitudes to have the decency to feel heartily ashamed.
Far from ashamed, the outraged opium traders hurried to London to address the British Parliament. They demanded their government either pay for their losses or force the Chinese to do so, even if that meant war. A future prime minister responded with contempt.
They gave you notice to abandon your contraband trade. When they found you would not do so, they had the right to drive you from their coasts. Justice, in my opinion, is with them. And whilst they, the pagans, the semi-civilized barbarians, have it on their side, we, the enlightened and civilized Christians, are pursuing objects at variance both with justice and religion. A war more calculated in its progress to cover this country with permanent disgrace, I do not know and have not heard of.
So hopefully that gave you a little more insight into the Opium Wars in terms of where they were going on and what the sort of Chinese reaction was, how it proceeded, how the British eventually decided to go to war. But this map might help a little bit with sort of seeing where these things were. If you look, this region down here that's now like Hong Kong and Macau, this is where most of these things were starting. That's where the opium was coming in. Also, those are the big sort of sites after the treaty that are really important. So after this first unequal treaty, there's a few more coming, but essentially what starts to happen is China loses its self-determination. So at the same moment that all of these other nation states and empires are investing in popular sovereignty or becoming more and more excited about the idea that a nation state is unique and separate and like beholden unto itself, China is slipping the other way because those same nation states, Britain, the United States, Japan, France, are going to carve off little pieces of it through these treaties. And the way they do that is pretty sophisticated. In the treaties, one of the things that comes up is extraterritoriality. It's over there, the word, in case you need to see it, somewhere in here. It basically means that if you happen to be British, for example, and you're in China and you commit a crime, according to this treaty, the Chinese can't arrest you or prosecute you. Only the British can do that. So it means that your subjects, if you're British or whatever, are not beholden to Chinese law, even within Chinese territory. It's a pretty nasty bit of legislation because what happens immediately is British folks commit crimes in China, and they know full well that they won't be punished for those crimes. If anything, they'll be put in front of a British court, and the British will find, oh, yes, you shouldn't have done that, but let's just get you out of China and no big deal. This results in murders, rapes, thefts, all kinds of anything you can imagine, where Europeans and Americans are completely excluded from justice in China. Also, in this initial treaty, you get a war indemnity. So even though the British attacked China, in the end, the British demand in the treaty that they be repaid an incredible amount of money, essentially for the cost of the war. But this was fairly common at the time. We're going to see this come in again with World War I, for example. Another interesting thing the British snuck into the first treaty was the most favored nation clause. And this has a really interesting role in international diplomacy. It basically says from now on, any treaty that China makes with a foreign nation, if it offers something the British want, the British automatically have it as well as part of this treaty. So any sort of economic rights or legal rights or treaty ports or anything like this that get put into a contract or a sort of agreement with another nation, the British get it as well. So this comes to be the example for how you do this. Over the next 50 years, the Dutch, the French, the Germans, the Japanese, everybody's going to start making, the Russians, are going to start making unequal contracts like this, unequal treaties with the Chinese. The British sort of set the tone for how this is going to look. Additionally, the British capture some territory with these treaties. So places like Hong Kong, for example, remain Chinese in a sense, but are leased for 99-year periods to the British, and the Chinese can't say no. Most of you probably don't remember because you're not quite old enough, but it happened not that long ago that Hong Kong became Chinese, and it had been sort of basically a British colony until quite recently. So this causes all kinds of problems for China. The leadership in China doesn't particularly know what to do. And after about the middle of the 19th century, a woman comes into power who is going to make some very interesting choices that sometimes line up really well with what you might expect the ruler to do, and other times not so much. So this is the Dowager Empress Cixi. She is going to be the main actual power. There's an emperor, but they're not really powerful. There's like a child emperor. She's the real power of the state during this time. And she is going to want to reform, of course. She's going to want to defend her country, but only to the extent that it doesn't decrease her power in any way. And her main objective is to prevent the dynasty from collapsing. So she's in charge of the Qing Dynasty. In her mind, the Qing Dynasty is the most important thing. But if the monarch only makes choices to stay in power, this can have a lot of unintended consequences, as we're going to see. One of the first things that is a result of this, both the Opium Wars, China's sort of failing sovereignty, the Empress claiming more and more power, is you get a lot of sort of internal rebellions and sort of pushback against foreign powers, against the state, against the Qing, against local leaders. It becomes a pretty big mess within the state. There's sort of wars over who's a legitimate source of authority. At the same time, you also have lots of Christian missionaries from Europe and particularly the United States that are introducing new ideas into China, and they don't always translate the way people might want. For example, in 1850, the Taiping Rebellion starts. It's opposed to the Qing government. They sort of argue that the Qing are letting down China. These unequal treaties have hurt the Chinese too much, and they should have never made them. You know, the Qing were unprepared to fight foreigners, etc. But the Taiping Rebellion is led by a guy who has converted to Christianity, but more than that claims to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. And the movement is a millennial religious movement. It's a Christian movement, and they argue like the end is coming soon, but they have a lot of practices that many Christians might be uncomfortable with. For example, murdering and killing your enemies, going to war. Although actually Christianity and war are deeply connected in several points, and continue to be. At this point, it really shocked Europeans, though. There was this new person in China claiming to be a king, claiming to be the literal brother of Christ, amassing a huge army and fighting against the state. Europeans kind of looked on and said, whoa, this is weird. We didn't mean to do that. We don't really want any part of it. But during the Taiping Rebellion, millions of people die. It's one of the most destructive wars in human history. It's an unintended consequence in many ways of the sort of attempt to modernize, westernize, the sort of conflict between traditional, remember we always kind of put that in quotes because it doesn't really mean anything, Chinese values versus what foreigners had to offer. Another conflict that occurs during this time is the Boxer Rebellion. Here's a image of some boxers. It was called this in the United States, right, because these people often practiced martial arts and used a series of traditional weapons as well as firearms. So sort of in the American press, right, they were boxers. Anyway, this begins, there's a drought. This is originally kind of anti-government, kind of in support of government, anti-foreign, arguing that the West was hurting China, that the sort of plight of the farmer and the citizen and the regular Chinese person was a result of all this foreign aggression, and that the Chinese ought to like take China back for themselves. They start to kill some missionaries, they kill some foreigners, they start to maybe barricade some cities to go on the offense against foreign intrusion. By this point, there's a number of foreigners living in major Chinese cities, those big trading ports that were ceded by treaty to Britain, to Germany, to the United States. And at times, this movement, although it's short, is supported by the Empress because they're claiming they want to return to like traditional Chinese values. And she sees that as maybe good for her dynasty. It doesn't work out that way. The United States, Japan, Britain, France, they all send troops, and in a coordinated effort, they put down this rebellion. When they do, they mess up a big chunk of northern China. They demand even more compensation from the Chinese government, even more rights get stripped away from China. So these internal rebellions also have a sort of foreign component to them. At the same time, it's not all blood and guts and rebellion and stuff. There's a sort of intellectual movement about what China can do. Remember, China's filled with scholars. There are literally millions of people that have spent their whole life reading books, studying, trying to be the sharpest, most sophisticated mind possible. And these people are going to bring their knowledge and expertise and education to bear on this problem. And it leads to different sorts of ideas about what people should do. Just like in the Ottoman Empire in Russia, a number of Chinese intellectuals and elites, military leaders, students come forward and say, look, we need to modernize here. We're getting our butt kicked by these foreigners who have industrialized, who've developed new economic and cultural and social practices. We should try some of that ourselves. And one of the first waves of this is often called the self-strengthening movement. It's not one movement, it's several different people and movements. And the idea was to incorporate Western technology, but keep Chinese values. Specifically, you don't have to abandon your language, your religion, your cultural practices. your morals, you can keep all of that. All they wanted was the sort of Western technology and Western advancements that made the foreigners militarily and economically strong. Everything else, don't worry about it. This had mixed results. Some Confucian scholars found it very difficult to participate in these sorts of movements. A lot of Confucianism was based around a very conservative idea that the best of China had existed in the past, and in order to be great in the future, you had to replicate what came in the past. This seems to be in opposition to the idea that you want to develop new technologies, new things like this. But there's big moments that really stand out where a lot of changes are being made. For example, in 1898, there's the 100-day reform. There's a sort of reinterpretation of these old Confucian values to support a really radical system of modernization of society. This is done by the government, with the government's support, the emperor at the time. And the idea is, look, Confucianism says, the past was great and we should replicate it, but what was so good about the past was they changed with the times, they adapted new things, they were very open and intellectual and stuff like this. So we can sort of do some mental gymnastics to mean that we should adopt all of these new things. But very quickly, the Empress clamps down on this and turns it off. She's the real seat of power, right? There's an emperor who's really not that important. She's the one really in power behind the throne. And part of these reforms include all of the stuff coming out of the Atlantic revolutions and Enlightenment thought and industrialization. So ideas about democracy, ideas about freedom, things that really start to challenge the strength of the monarchy. So the Empress cuts these off because they're threatening to her position in the dynasty. So Chinese attempts at reform are really mixed. Some of these are successful, some of them not so much. These empires across Asia, these states, are reforming to sort of meet the times, but they're not always successful for a lot of different reasons. One, they're just sort of behind in time. Industrialization is happening really quickly in Europe and the United States and in Japan. And the sort of level of difference between an industrialized nation and a non-industrialized nation in terms of economic power, military power is absolutely tremendous. And so if you didn't catch up quick enough, you just couldn't compete in those arenas. At the same time, there were a lot of debates about if we adopt all of these sorts of British or European ideas and policies, are we going to lose who we are? Is it going to destroy the Chinese or Russian soul or something if we become too European? One thing you'll notice is we didn't talk at all about Japan. Well, the next one is going to be all about Japan, but I'm not going to record a lecture. I'm just going to show a video for it about the Meiji Restoration. It's a great video, even though it's a little bit dated, but just the people they have do it is awesome. Because Japan is going to face all of these same problems, but they're one of the few states that is very successful in the way they modernize and respond to these threats. They're often sort of compared to China, like China did it this way and it turned out poorly, Japan did it this way and it turned out very differently. They were successful in a lot of senses that might be leading somewhere bad, but still they were successful in terms of industrializing. So stay tuned for that one on the Meiji Restoration. There's a good reading up on, it's not on Canvas as it is D2L, about that. And just, yeah, check that out next time. As always, let me know if you have any questions. See you soon.